I've always had a thing for exploring places that no one else dares to step foot in. There's something about being in a place that was once full of life but is now forgotten that pulls me in a way that's hard to explain. So, when I heard about that abandoned building downtown, I didn't think twice about checking it out. I got there late in the afternoon, and the sun was almost setting. The shadows had already started stretching, making the broken windows look even more eerie. The facade was filthy, cracked in several places, and part of the roof had collapsed. It was the perfect setup for an exploration. I went in through the front door, or at least what was left of it, hanging from a single hinge gently swaying in the wind. Inside, the smell of mold and rotting wood was almost suffocating. Everything was covered in dust, with debris scattered all over the floor. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by my footsteps and the distant drip of water echoing somewhere in the distance. With each step, the floor creaked under my feet. I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in, trying to adjust to the darkness and the decaying atmosphere of the place. It was now or never. After a few minutes of wandering around the lower floors, I started to relax a bit. Curiosity always seems to win over that initial fear. But then I noticed something that made me stop. On the dust-covered floor there were footprints. And they weren't old, no, they looked pretty fresh. That's when it hit me, I might not be the only one here. I glanced around, straining to hear anything that might hint someone else was nearby. Silence. I tried not to dwell on it, but I have to admit, I started paying a lot more attention to my surroundings. I kept exploring, but now my ears were tuned into any unusual sound. With every step, my flashlight illuminated parts of the building that were completely collapsed, with fallen wooden beams and shattered remnants of furniture. That's when I heard a noise. Something small, the distant sound of debris being moved somewhere ahead of me. I stopped again, took a deep breath, and tried to listen more closely. It couldn't have been the wind. I looked in the direction the sound had come from, but all I could see was darkness and a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. I decided to keep moving, but my heart was definitely beating a little faster now. I headed up to the next floor and things started getting weirder. The building was already in terrible shape, but here the sense of abandonment felt even heavier. My flashlight began to flicker, which made no sense because I had just replaced the batteries before leaving the house. I tried to ignore it and kept climbing. Halfway up, I heard another sound. This time it was clearer. Footsteps. But they weren't mine. They were light, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. I froze instantly, looking behind me, to the sides, anywhere that might give me a clue about who, or what, was there. But I didn't see anything. Just the same silence, occasionally broken by the creaks of the walls and floor. The flashlight flickered again, and this time it nearly went out completely. I started walking faster, feeling the pressure build up. Every time the light failed, the building felt more claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in around me. The hallway I was crossing seemed longer than it should have been. At every corner, I'd take a quick glance before moving forward, hoping maybe to find another way out or some sign that I was still alone. But deep down, I already knew I wasn't. Even without hearing anything else, the tension didn't let up. I had to get off this floor, and fast. I didn't even have time to think. As soon as I turned the next corner, I saw a shadow move quickly at the far end of the hallway. I didn't stop to try and figure out what it was. My body reacted before my mind could process it, and I started running. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls of the building, and behind me, lighter but quick footsteps kept pace. Whoever, or whatever, was there was following me. Every heartbeat felt louder than the last, and I could barely control my breathing. I didn't look back. I didn't want to risk seeing what might be right behind me. I just ran, dodging debris, my lungs burning. I sped past empty rooms and endless hallways, all with the same desolate appearance. The only thought in my mind was, I need to get out of here. Now. Finally, I spotted an open window at the end of a side hallway. Without hesitation, I sprinted towards it, already planning my escape. It was my only shot. Something told me that if I stayed another second, I wouldn't get another chance. I reached the window and, without a second thought, threw myself out. The drop wasn't too high, but the impact on the rooftop of the building next door knocked the wind out of me for a few seconds. A sharp pain shot through my shoulder. I had probably injured it in the fall, but that didn't matter. I was out of the building. I quickly turned my head to look back, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the window right where I had just jumped from, there was someone, or something. All I could make out was a silhouette against the dim light from outside. It didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there watching me. A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't stick around to try and make sense of it. I got up, limping a little, and moved away as quickly as I could. I've always been curious about abandoned places, and that old, shut-down building was no different. I'd heard a few stories about it. People said folks had disappeared around the area, but I never paid much attention to that. Today, my curiosity got the best of me. The old, rusted-out factory, crumbling and in ruins, was just sitting there, waiting for someone brave enough to explore it. And, of course, that someone was me. I entered through the side, pushing open an old gate that creaked, nearly falling apart in my hands. Inside, the scene wasn't much different from what I expected. Cracked walls, dust-covered floors, and a few broken windows where the wind snuck through, bringing with it an overwhelming sense of abandonment. The place smelled of rust and rotting wood. This wasn't my first time in a place like this, so it felt strangely familiar. There was no sign of anyone, just a heavy silence, as if the world outside had faded away. I kept walking, the only sound being the echo of my footsteps. So far, nothing out of the ordinary. The factory seemed like just another one of those forgotten places, and I was ready to find out what else it had in store. As I continued down the factory's hallways, I started noticing details that didn't quite match the abandoned state of the place. First, I spotted a water bottle tossed in a corner, still half full. It wasn't enough to make me stop, but it was enough to put me on alert. A few steps later, I found a half-open backpack left near a wall. Inside were some wrinkled clothes and an old pair of sneakers, but what really caught my attention was that it all seemed recent. This wasn't stuff that had been left behind years ago. On the contrary, it looked like someone had just left it there and taken off in a hurry. The atmosphere began to shift, but I kept my cool. Maybe it was just a homeless person using the building as shelter. I'd seen that before in other places I'd explored, and nothing had ever happened. I kept walking, a bit suspicious but still trying to convince myself there was no reason to be worried. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, but now I started noticing footprints. And they weren't old. It was as if someone had walked through there not too long before. It was becoming more and more clear that I wasn't the only one wandering through that building. I tried to keep going, pretending that none of it was a big deal. After all, footprints and a discarded backpack didn't necessarily mean there was any real danger. But deep down, things didn't feel as normal anymore. And that's when the noise started. Something metallic fell in the distance. I stopped immediately, trying to listen more carefully. The sound echoed through the empty hallways, and for a second, I wondered if I had heard it right. I stood there, silent, paying attention, but the quiet returned as quickly as the noise had come. I took a deep breath and kept moving. It had to be a loose piece of metal or maybe just the wind. Still, the factory felt different now. Each of my footsteps seemed louder than I wanted them to be. The echo seemed to spread in all directions. A little farther ahead, I reached a partially open door, chained shut from the outside. I moved closer, peeking through the small gap, and saw what looked like a small maintenance room. And that's when the discomfort turned into something much bigger. Inside the room, I saw ropes scattered across the floor, an old toolbox, and a blanket tossed in the corner. It looked like some kind of makeshift holding area. This wasn't normal. Something was very, very wrong. What I saw in that room made me stop cold. The ropes, the toolbox, the blanket, it all looked like it had been used recently. I couldn't fool myself anymore. This wasn't just some random hideout. And right at that moment, the sound of distant voices echoed down the hallway. Real voices, people talking, though I couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but they were getting closer. My heart started pounding, and this time I didn't try to rationalize it. I needed to get out of there. I glanced around and backed away from the room. The hallway seemed narrower now, and with every step, I became more aware of the noise I was making. I couldn't just run, it would draw too much attention. I tried to move carefully, but the voices kept getting closer. The more distance I put between myself and that room, the clearer the voices became. They were arguing, talking about something that seemed important, but all I could focus on was not being seen. I found a stack of old boxes in a corner and crouched behind them, holding my breath. The voices passed by closer than I had expected. I couldn't see who they were, but I knew enough to realize I didn't want to find out. The voices began to fade, but I didn't dare move yet. I stayed crouched behind the boxes, trying to steady my breathing. The sound of their footsteps grew more distant, but the tension didn't let up. My mind was racing, and I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. When I finally felt like the coast was clear, I stood up slowly, listening for any hint that they might come back. Now, my only focus was getting out. The way back seemed longer than I remembered, and every turn I made gave me the eerie feeling that I was being followed. I moved quickly but tried my best not to make any noise. The graffiti-covered walls and broken windows no longer had that curious, abandoned charm. Everything felt threatening. When I finally reached the rusty gate I had entered through, I shoved it open and ran outside without looking back. I didn't stop until I was far enough away, the streetlights starting to come into view. Relief hit me fast, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much bigger than I had realized. I pulled out my phone and called the police, reporting what I had just seen. I never went back to that street again. I've always had a thing for exploring abandoned places. The old textile factory in the outskirts of the city was one of those hidden gems that few people knew existed. I had heard about it before, but only now decided it was time to check it out. I arrived early before the sun got too high in the sky. The entrance was through a gap in the rusted wire fence, an obvious invitation for any explorer. As soon as I slipped through the opening, silence took over. The factory was a monument to abandonment. The concrete was cracked, and the broken windows reflected the light in a strange way. The ground was covered in shards of glass and rust, mixed with plants that had slowly crept into the space over the years. Everything seemed so forgotten. I snapped a few photos, admiring the contrast between the decay and nature slowly reclaiming the area. It was the kind of scene that made me lose track of time. As I wandered through the corridors, I started to feel more confident. It was almost as if the place was meant to be this way, empty, peaceful, waiting to be rediscovered. The remains of old machinery, the corroded metal doors, everything was exactly as I had imagined. Yet, as I moved deeper into the factory, I started to realize that the silence here was different from what I had expected. As I ventured deeper into the factory's corridors, something started to gnaw at me. I can't quite explain it, but the place no longer felt as deserted as it had before. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dust. They weren't old. They looked fresh, like someone had been here within the last few hours. I stopped for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Up until then, I thought I was the only curious soul daring enough to explore this forgotten corner of the city. I kept walking, but slower now, and began noticing more signs. Next to one of the machines, there was a water bottle tossed on the ground, still with some liquid inside. A bit further ahead, I saw charcoal markings on the walls. It wasn't street art or graffiti, it looked more like some kind of symbol or marking, as if someone was trying to leave a trail. The discomfort inside me grew, but I tried to push it aside. Maybe someone else had the same idea and explored the place recently, I thought. But with each step, that explanation felt harder to believe. The muffled sounds I had brushed off earlier were becoming clearer now. Footsteps? Breathing? Maybe it was just my imagination. Yet the factory, once silent, now seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the air, which had initially felt liberating, now pressed down on me, urging me to tread carefully. As I walked, trying to keep calm, I turned the corner of a narrower hallway and saw something that froze me in place for a few seconds. In one of the corners, there was a dirty mattress on the floor with blankets piled on top. Next to it were empty food cans and a pack of cigarettes. This was no longer just an abandoned factory. Someone had been living here, or at least using the place as a shelter. And I was standing right in the middle of it. I moved closer slowly, scanning the area. There were clear signs of recent occupation. The mattress still looked used, and the food cans weren't covered in dust like everything else around here. My heart started to race and I knew I shouldn't be there. Something felt very wrong, and I needed to leave before I ran into whoever owned that makeshift camp. That's when I heard a low sound, almost like the shuffle of feet, coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around quickly, and at the far end of the corridor, a figure appeared. A man standing there watching me. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out many details, but it was clear that he wasn't there by accident. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there staring at me. I began to slowly step backward, trying not to draw any more attention. But with every step I took, he took one forward. My instincts screamed that it was time to run. And that's exactly what I did. My legs took off before my mind could even process what was happening. I ran as fast as I could through the factory's corridors, my feet kicking up debris and shards of glass scattered on the ground. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps. It wasn't a frantic sprint like mine. He was walking quickly, purposefully, as if he knew I didn't have many options to escape. I tried to remember the way I had come in, but now all the corridors looked the same. Everything around me blurred into a mix of peeling walls and filthy concrete. Suddenly, I spotted a rusty metal staircase ahead of me. Without a second thought, I started climbing, my feet pounding against the steps, the sound echoing through the entire place. I reached the top, gasping for breath, only to realize I was cornered. At the end of the hallway there was a small, broken window, my only chance. Without thinking, I dashed toward it and threw myself through the opening, landing in a pile of leaves and trash on the ground outside. I scrambled to my feet, my body shaking, and ran to my car. I glanced back one last time. The man was standing at the window watching me, but he didn't follow. I sped away, the adrenaline still surging through my veins.